There is a sea on Earth spanning nearly 2 million square miles that has never once touched land. No coastline, no islands, no shore of any kind, anywhere along its entire border. For more than 100 years, scientists have known this patch of open ocean is where an entire species begins its life. And in all that time, not one researcher has ever directly witnessed the event happen. 4 separate ocean currents wrap around it like a wall of moving water, holding a slice of the Atlantic in place without a single grain of sand touching its edge. Ships have drifted through it for 500 years, and sailors have written about it since the age of Columbus. What's coming is a walk through every documented layer of this place. The currents that build it, the weed that names it, the fish that vanish into it. And the strangest part is saved for last, because even now, with satellite tags and genetic sequencing, the single most basic fact about what happens inside the Sargasso Sea has never been recorded by human eyes. Here's what we actually know. The Sargasso Sea sits inside the North Atlantic Gyre, a slow, clockwise rotation formed by 4 major currents: the Gulf Stream to the west, the North Atlantic Current to the north, the Canary Current to the east, and the North Atlantic Equatorial Current to the south. Those currents don't just border the sea, they define it. Every other named sea on the planet is bounded at least partly by land: a coastline, an island chain, a continental shelf. The Sargasso Sea has none of that. Its edges move with the water itself, which means its boundaries actually shift by dozens of miles depending on the season and the strength of the surrounding currents. That absence of land is exactly why the region carries the name it does. Portuguese sailors in the 1500s noticed clumps of golden brown seaweed floating loose on the surface, unattached to any rocky shore, and the name that stuck traces back to the Portuguese word for a certain kind of grape, because the small floating air bladders on the weed reminded them of clusters of fruit. That seaweed, Sargassum, is one of the only plants on Earth that completes its entire life cycle while floating free in open water, reproducing by fragmentation rather than by seed. It never roots. It never touches bottom. Colonies of it can drift for years, accumulating into mats that stretch for miles across the gyre's calm center. Christopher Columbus himself recorded encountering these mats in 1492, and his crew reportedly grew uneasy at the sight of so much vegetation with no land in view, worried they had wandered into shallow water above a hidden reef. They hadn't. Some accounts from that period describe soundings taken with a weighted line, finding no bottom at all beneath thousands of feet of open water. That unease is worth remembering, because it planted a story that later sailors would exaggerate for centuries. That calm is where the old stories start, and where most of them stop making sense. For generations afterward, sailors described the Sargasso as a place where ships became tangled in weeds so thick it could trap a hull, where vessels simply stalled in the mat and were never seen again. That version is folklore, not documentation. There's no verified account of a ship physically ensnared by Sargassum thick enough to hold it in place. But here's the detail that doesn't fit the myth cleanly. The real hazard was almost worse for being so ordinary. The Sargasso Sea sits beneath a subtropical high-pressure zone, meaning wind is scarce and unpredictable for long stretches. Sailing ships genuinely did stall there for days or weeks at a time, burning through food and drinking water while going nowhere. And some historical logs describe crews rationing or even discarding livestock when supplies ran short during a becalmed crossing. The danger was real. It just wasn't the seaweed doing it. Is it fair to call a place cursed, as old maritime folklore did, when the actual documented hazard was simply a lack of wind rather than any monster in the water? That's worth sitting with, because it says something about how ordinary facts get inflated into myth over centuries of retelling. And this particular sea has one more layer of ordinary fact that turned out to be far stranger than any old sailor's tale once scientists actually looked closely. If the myths were exaggerated, the science that followed was almost the opposite: restrained, patient, and stretched out over decades. That's where a Danish biologist named Johannes Schmidt enters the story. Starting in the early 1900s, Schmidt spent close to 20 years hauling fine mesh nets through the Atlantic, collecting the tiny, transparent larvae of the European eel wherever his research vessels found them, and plotting each catch on a chart. The pattern that emerged was almost too clean. The smallest larvae, the youngest ones, kept appearing in smaller and smaller catch clusters that all converged on the same stretch of ocean, the Sargasso Sea. If topics like this catch your attention, real, documented anomalies in specific places on Earth, not speculation dressed up as mystery, this channel is built around exactly that kind of case. And the next layer of this particular story is where the science gets genuinely strange rather than just interesting. Schmidt's conclusion, published in the 1920s, was that both the European eel and its close relative, the American eel, are born in that same general region of the Sargasso Sea, then drift for months or years on ocean currents toward the coastlines of Europe and North America, where they mature in freshwater rivers before eventually returning to the sea to spawn and die. That's a genuinely strange life cycle on its own. A freshwater river eel that begins and ends its life thousands of miles out in open ocean, crossing an entire ocean basin twice in one lifetime. And it's not a fringe theory. It's the accepted scientific account, cited in marine biology textbooks for roughly a century now. No one disputes the first part. It's the second part that causes the argument. Confirming where the larvae are found is one thing. Watching the actual spawning event, adult eels releasing eggs and sperm in open water, is another thing entirely, and it has never happened. Not once, not by Schmidt, not by any research vessel since, not by any diver, camera, or remote sensor in the century since his surveys began. Researchers have narrowed the likely spawning zone using larval size and distribution data. They've tagged adult eels with satellite trackers and followed their migration routes for thousands of miles into the Sargasso Sea. And the tags do converge on the same general area Schmidt identified. What the data doesn't explain is what happens once the eels arrive. That's where the documented trail stops. Adult eels that leave European and North American rivers undergo dramatic physical changes before their final migration. Their digestive systems shut down entirely, their eyes grow noticeably larger, and their skin shifts from a dull yellow-brown to a metallic silver suited for deep water. They swim for months, and tagging studies have tracked some individuals descending to depths of several thousand feet during the journey, likely to avoid predators along the way. And then, somewhere in that stretch of water with no coastline, the signal goes dark. The tags eventually detach or fail on schedule. No one has recorded what happens next. This is where most explanations quietly stop, and it's worth sitting with exactly what that means. How do eel larvae, with no adult present to guide them, navigate an ocean crossing that can take the better part of a year? And how do their adult descendants find their way back to this same unmarked patch of open water, generation after generation, with no coastline and no landmark to steer by? That has never been demonstrated. The leading hypothesis involves a combination of sensing the Earth's magnetic field and following consistent current patterns. But no study has confirmed the actual mechanism, and this remains one of the most cited open questions in migratory biology. There's one detail researchers keep coming back to, and it only deepens the puzzle. Genetic studies have shown that European and American eel populations, despite ending up thousands of miles apart in rivers on opposite sides of an ocean, appear to share overlapping spawning areas within the Sargasso Sea, close enough that limited interbreeding may occur between the two species. That would mean two distinct species, adapted to entirely different continents, somehow converge on the same small stretch of ocean at roughly the same time of year to reproduce. A level of precision that's hard to reconcile with the fact that nobody has ever seen how either species actually locates that spot. Officially, the explanation is simple. Eels spawn in the Sargasso Sea because every line of indirect evidence points there. The problem is that the officially accepted account rests entirely on indirect evidence, larval maps, tagging data, genetic sampling, and none of it, added together, actually shows the moment eels spawn. Some marine biologists have proposed that spawning happens at extreme depth in near total darkness, which would explain why no vessel or diver has ever recorded it. Others suggest it may occur only under narrow seasonal or lunar conditions that research expeditions have simply never matched by chance in over 100 years of trying. Neither explanation has been confirmed. Both remain, formally, unresolved. That should have settled the question by now, given the sheer amount of research the topic has attracted. It didn't. Eel populations in both Europe and North America have declined sharply in recent decades. European eel numbers are estimated by some conservation assessments to have dropped by somewhere around 90% since the 1980s, and the species is now listed as critically endangered. Researchers studying the decline have pointed to river barriers, changing ocean currents, and shifting water temperatures as likely contributing factors. But because no one has ever observed a natural spawning event, there's no confirmed baseline for what a healthy spawning population inside the Sargasso Sea should even look like. Scientists are trying to protect a life stage of the species that they have never actually witnessed with their own eyes. Why a species can be tracked with such precision, from larva to adulthood, across thousands of miles, right up to the very edge of the spawning grounds, and still never once be observed completing the single act that defines its entire life cycle, is worth arguing about in the comments, because reasonable researchers land on genuinely different explanations for it. That absence sits at the center of everything else this sea represents. The Sargasso Sea also hosts an entire ecosystem found nowhere else on the planet. Species like the Sargassum fish, camouflaged almost perfectly to match the floating weed, along with crabs, shrimp, and sea slugs that spend their whole lives clinging to mats that never touch a seafloor at all. Sea turtle hatchlings from beaches as far away as Florida and the Caribbean drift into the Sargasso Sea as juveniles and use its floating cover as a nursery for years before returning to coastal waters as adults. What actually triggers the spawning event itself, deep inside all of that floating cover? A specific depth, a season, a lunar phase, some combination no expedition has ever matched, is a question that, after a century of looking, still has no answer. So return to where this started. A stretch of ocean spanning nearly 2 million square miles, bordered by nothing but current, holding no coastline and no fixed shape. What's proven is substantial. The currents that define its boundaries are mapped precisely. The larval data pointing to it as the birthplace of 2 eel species has held up under a century of scrutiny, reinforced since by genetic sampling and satellite tracking evidence. What remains unresolved is just as real. No scientist has ever witnessed an eel spawn in the wild, anywhere. And the exact mechanism by which entire generations return unaided to this same unmarked patch of open water has never been demonstrated. The Sargasso Sea doesn't need an invented mystery. It already has a documented one, sitting quietly at the heart of one of the best-studied migrations in the animal kingdom, still waiting for someone to actually see it happen.